This presentation of History with a Local is with Edward Wotitzky.
And a well-known attorney in our town, Edward Wotitzky, who will share with us his family history. And we're happy to welcome today a number of his family members, Hannah, Sabrina. Who else is here? I think there's other Joanne. So a number of the family members are here, and we're happy to
Kenny, this whole group.
So we welcome them here today too, and hope you will enjoy. I'm pleased to introduce Edward Wotitzky.
Thanks, Teresa. I have been involved with the History Center with Gene and Teresa ever since it started, and one of the main purposes of the History Center is to maintain an archive of history with people's notes and letters and photographs. And when I was getting ready for this, I thought it'd be pretty easy because I figured, well, okay, I'm whatever, sixth. I don't know if I'm the sixth one. Anyway, we'll figure that out.
Maybe Jacob is. Maybe
Yeah, my son is maybe, and Hannah. But I realized when I was going through this how easy it is to lose history and how fragile it is. I'd heard a lot of things, but I never really paid as much attention to it as I really wish I had. And it's easy to get things out of context and out of time. So what I tried to do was to put things in some sort of a chronological order. My family has, I made some notes, but don't worry, I'm probably not going to be able to go through all this. My family, the Wotitzky family, has been in Punta Gorda, lived and worked in Punta Gorda since around 1886. And they worked in all kinds of different fields throughout all these years. First and primarily, they were merchants, had a general store, and had a boat or a schooner that they used for trading. They were in the newspaper business. One of my relatives actually started the Punta Gorda Herald, and my father worked at the Punta Gorda Herald, as I'll kind of go into a little bit. Teaching and education was a big part of my family's background, and it's kind of nice that the History Center is displaying a lot of the history of Charlotte High School and schools at Punta Gorda. There's some really pretty fascinating pictures in the room. Politics and legislative matters, my father particularly was, and I'm going to focus a lot on him because frankly that's who I know more about. And he was born in 1912 and he died in 2005. So he really saw during his lifetime a lot of the history of Punta Gorda. When he was born, there were no paved roads. Marion Avenue was covered with oyster shells. There might have been one car in town, and by the time he died, well, we're kind of current. We're flying to the moon and jets in 2005. So I'm going to try to go through this in somewhat of a chronological order. I figured when I started getting ready for this, if I had some kind of a timeline, it would be a little bit easier to keep things organized. So I went to Publix or the drugstore and bought a big poster board because I figured, well, I'll get a Sharpie and I'll just write stuff down. And so, Hannah, my daughter here, she's very, very savvy about doing PowerPoints and all this, and so is Teresa. And she said, no, let's just do it as a PowerPoint. I said, I don't know, I'm not too comfortable with that. But anyway, they did put this together, and if it works, I think it's really good. So I'm going to kind of go through this a little bit, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about some of what I think are kind of either interesting or important parts of the history. This is kind of a family tree. My great-great-grandfather, the first person of the Wotitzky family that came to Punta Gorda was Jacob Wotitzky and his wife Rose. and they came here in around 1886. That was my dad's grandfather. My dad's other grandfather from his mother's side was Gus Hart, and we don't really know, at least I couldn't find out who his wife was. But they were also pioneers here, and they moved to Punta Gorda around the same time that Jacob did, probably a year or 2 years later. My great grandfather had 2 children, Edward, who I'm named after, and that was my grandfather. He was born in 1876 and died in 1941, and Laura Wotitzky, who was married to Kirby Seward, who was also kind of a pioneer in Punta Gorda. On my grandmother's family, Gus Hart and his spouse, they came to Punta Gorda. They had 3 girls, and Edward and Celia got married in 1908. And we don't have a lot of people in our family seem to be a little bit older when they have kids. So it could be 6 generations easily by here, but it wasn't that much. They were married in 1908, and they had 2 children, my father Leo and my uncle Frank. And my dad married Zena Cox Wotitzky in 1952 or 1953, and then we were born. And my uncle, he had a kind of distinguished career as an attorney also. I'm not going to really focus as much on him, but he was actually was younger than my dad, but he got out of law school and started practicing law before my dad did. And he married Helen Bronner, who actually is Joanne's aunt. And in fact, Helen was the clerk of the court. So there's a lot of history with Helen and with my uncle Frank also. So this is sort of the timeline.
Could you stand like on that side, maybe more, because we can't see them.
Oh yeah. Let me move this here. So I just with Hannah's help, I put together kind of a timeline, and it's a little bit rough. I'm going to kind of skim through it, and then I want to go over a few little stories and other tidbits. 1886, as near as we can tell, that's when Jacob and his family moved came to Punta Gorda, and that's kind of an interesting story. The story is they were in South Carolina at the time doing some farming there, and they all got malaria. They were pretty sick. So they decided to move further south, which was probably more mosquitoes. And they got on a boxcar and came all the way down to Punta Gorda. When they got here, shortly after they got here, the Hart family moved to Punta Gorda. And 1887 was kind of an important date because that's when the city of Punta Gorda became incorporated. And Jacob, he was pretty, I don't think he really spoke sort of broken English from what I'm told, but he was pretty involved in the local scene, and he was one of the 34 leaders of the community that incorporated Punta Gorda, the city of Punta Gorda, and that's probably a whole other story. It started out as Tribune, and then I think he started the town, but there was some sort of a dispute that led to its name being changed. Okay, I'm going to go through this a little bit quick now. In 1893, Kirby Seward, who was my father's uncle, married his father's sister, Laura. He started the Punta Gorda Herald, and he ran it and operated it for a while. In 1903, Jacob died, and I might as well do this now. We have the only picture we found of
Get ready.
Jacob.
Oh,
no.
It's always got
You're right, he died.
So we know he's dead.
He is dead.
Then the clerk would put in the adding machine the price. Well, she could, when they were doing that, she would add the numbers, and she would have the total as quick as that machine. It was pretty neat. In 1912, my dad was born. My uncle was born in 1916. During the 20s, there were actually 3 hurricanes that hit the town, and there's some stories that I've heard about. My father told me his father at that time was operating a general store, and they had occasion a couple times during these hurricanes to go from Gill Street where they lived down to I think it was around Sullivan Street where their store was, and he said it was, you know, things were flying around and pretty bad. There was less to destroy back then than there is now. But in 1921, the first bridge was built, so over Peace River. In 1929, a lot happened in the 20s. In 1929, my dad graduated high school with the University of Florida. The second bridge was built in 1931. Again, like I said, a lot of the history that I know is through my father. In 1933, he graduated from University of Florida, not as an attorney, but as a teacher. He wasn't able to get his going to law school. Just, you know, he ran out of money. I mean, these are the Depression years, and it was pretty rough. They all had it rough, and I've always been sort of surprised or really happily amazed that he was actually able to get through school during those years. Anyway, comes back to Punta Gorda in 1934, 35, actually worked for the Social Security Administration. In 36, he came back to Punta Gorda, and the real, you know, where Dad really got involved in history was when he was in the state legislature. He was elected to the legislature the first time in 1938, and he served until he got beat in 1950. And there's kind of an interesting story about that. In 1941, my grandfather passed away, and then this kind of is where I end the timeline. 1953, that was 3 years before I was born. Dad gets out of law school. He goes into practice with my uncle Frank, and he gets married. So that's. I'm sorry, I want to go back.
In case you forgot.
In case, yeah, just in case you forgot what that person looked like back in those days. A couple things I wanted to add about, you know, a lot of these people who I think came to Punta Gorda in those early days, they had to have, I always thought they had to have a reason. They were either running away from something, or they were adventurers, or traders, or fishermen. I mean, it was obviously very rough down here. There was the end of the railroad line. There wasn't a whole lot. Obviously, there was no air conditioning. There probably was some electricity, but not very much. But Jacob Wotitzky and his family, Jacob immigrated to the United States in, I think, around the Civil War time, probably right around the beginning of the Civil War, or shortly thereafter. He was a young man when he immigrated to the United States, and he came to New York. I think he had some family in New York, and he married Rose after the Civil War. Y'all heard of the term carpetbagger? I think this is just like my guess, but my guess is that Jacob was kind of a peddler. He had a push cart and he sold things, and I think he was probably a carpetbagger, and he felt like there was a lot of business that could be had in the South, which was being reconstructed at the time. So he and his family went to South Carolina, and he managed to scrape enough money together, and he bought some land, and he had a rice farm on it. And I guess that was a big crop in South Carolina at the time. Like I mentioned before, the whole family got sick with malaria, and they loaded up on a boxcar, literally. I know that I've heard this a lot, so I'm assuming it's a true story. They all loaded up everything they had on a boxcar, and they took it to the end of the railroad line, which was Punta Gorda at the time. And so he got here, they loaded off the boxcar. He might have had some things prearranged or something, but they ended up staying here forever. when they got here, just to put in a little bit more context of what things were like when they arrived in the 1880s, the hotel, there was a resort hotel that was located where the city marketplace vacant property is now. That was just being started. That was just under construction when they came in. There were just a few houses in the old historic district of Punta Gorda, and really hardly anything on Marion Avenue. There were probably a couple of shops, and Marion Avenue wasn't paved. Eventually they decided they needed to do something, so they put oyster shells on it just to keep the cars from getting stuck all the time in the middle of the road. Again, like I say, Jacob was active in the community. He was one of the 34 settlers who met in Pine Level, which was in the county seat of Manatee County, which is what we were originally in, and they incorporated Punta Gorda. The business that my family was in and my grandfather was in was a general store. I kind of wish it was sort of like a Walton's, but it didn't work out quite that way. But the other thing that I thought was very interesting about my grandfather, he was an entrepreneur, and like a lot of people who settled here, I think he was very adventurous. I think you had to be to move here. Sometimes I think you still have to be to live here. But actually, Jacob homesteaded, and I was told he homesteaded the southern part of Gasparilla Island, which is where Boca Grande is, and that would have been in probably in the 1990s. And I've heard that story for a long time, and when I was getting ready for this, 1890s, yeah. Sorry, 1890s, I wish it was. Thanks. You're right, Teresa, people correct you when you do this. And,
I do it frequently.
So what was required to homestead back then was, if you had a claim, you were trying to claim a piece of property, you were required to improve at least 3 acres. And I don't know exactly what all that meant. Probably cultivate it, fence it in, maybe put a little house or shack on it. A person was also required to live on the land at least 3 months a year for 3 years. And he did that. He accomplished that. When I first heard about homesteading, I thought, that's kind of, you got to stay there all the time. I couldn't imagine just someone just sitting there on Gasparilla Island. It was just nothing there, just sand. But that's how it was. Unfortunately, for I guess the family, it didn't last. There was apparently in the late 1800s there was a very severe depression throughout the United States, and my grandfather at the time was not able to hold on to the property. They couldn't pay the taxes. They ended up losing it. So. Anyway, crime you rebel, right? The other thing that Jacob was, I think, noted for, he traded with the settlers up and down the west coast of Florida, and he apparently was doing pretty good because he was able to buy a schooner that would have, I think, the capacity for around 10 tons of merchandise to be loaded in it. And he would go up and down the west coast, all the way around the west coast to the Miami area, and they would trade, and apparently did pretty well with that for a while. In fact, my grandfather was really probably more of an adventurer than a businessman, and he, I think, really enjoyed the trading on that boat. My other family was Gus Hart. Just wanted to mention a couple things about Gus Hart and his family. We really don't know a lot about him, but we do know that he must have come into the United States, and he was a young man also before the Civil War, and he got a commission in the United States Cavalry after the Civil War. And he was stationed in the Dakota area, and he was with under General Custer. Thank goodness, not at the time place where bad things happen. But I always thought that was kind of cool, you know. And by the way, my ancestors were Jewish, and that was also a little bit created somewhat of a I don't know how tough it was, but they never said anything about it being difficult. But I have a feeling they did face some difficulties throughout the years, but I'm not sure about that. Anyway, so after Gus Hart survived the cavalry and got out of the service, he and his family went to Savannah. He got married. He came to Punta Gorda around 1887, and he also opened a dry goods shop, a mercantile business. My aunt Laura, I knew her a little bit when I was really young. She was interesting. She was married to Kirby Seward. Now, Kirby Seward was the originator, or he founded the Punta Gorda Herald. He wasn't Jewish. He was Baptist, as we are. And when he and Laura got married, apparently Jacob was just pretty incensed by all that. So he ended up giving whatever he had to Edward, his son. But it actually turned out that Laura and Kirby were a lot more affluent because he was doing very well with the newspaper business and other businesses. And in fact, we do have a couple of pictures. This is, by the way, this is a picture of the store, the general store that my great-grandfather Jacob started. I have no idea who the people in that picture are, and I couldn't tell you if any of my relatives are in there. That's just another picture of Jacob. I'll go back to that. But this was Laura and Kirby Seward, and they were another picture of her when they were a little bit older. That's how I remember. I always thought she was kind of mean looking. She was deaf too, toward the end of her life, and it was my dad and my uncle, when they were young, my dad would tell them they'd kind of make fun of her, you know, because she was deaf. And my dad got to be pretty deaf. He said, well, payback. Yeah, that's what he said. He said, probably payback. Anyway, they lived in a house on Gill Street in Punta Gorda, and it's the same house that I believe Paul and Karen Alessandroni live in, which is, it's between Gill Street. It's the block of Gill Street between Greta Esternade and Marion Avenue. My dad's father, and that's a picture of him, he and my grandmother. My dad's father, like I said, he was kind of an adventurer. He really wasn't he wasn't probably the best businessman around. He was more, actually, he wanted to be an attorney his whole life. And when he was old enough for school, he got admitted to the Citadel in South Carolina. I guess through Jacob, they had some connections there as well. And so he went to the Citadel, and he didn't graduate, got malaria again, and ended up coming back, and he joined the family business. He also was real active in community affairs. And when Charlotte County was, I think, incorporated or started, he was the first supervisor of elections, which was an appointed position. And he was also a justice of the peace. So he kind of got to experience a little bit about, I think, being an attorney, but he never was able to attain that goal. The other thing about Edward that I found interesting is his trips on the Malio, which was the schooner that they used for trading. And he, there's a lot of quite a few stories about the Malio, and there were a lot of adventures that he and there was a Captain Oscar Black, who was the captain of the boat and they would get crew and everything. And a lot of times they would end up with a lot of cash from trading and from bartering and selling things. And they ended up with, I think at one time, a couple $1,000s, and they almost ended up losing it. There was some wild story that I can't really remember all the details of. But as far as operating the store, they had hurricanes. They also had the fires back then, and both of the general stores that my family had, that Edward had, they ended up burning down at one point or another. And it was one of the ironies of that was that the Mural Society used one of the pictures of the store, and they painted a mural on one of the buildings in Punta Gorda of my grandfather's store. And it was ironic because the building that they painted that mural on was the Heinemann Insurance Building. And I remember Dad was speaking at the unveiling of the mural, and he pointed out the irony of the fact that it was really interesting that mural was on the insurance building when their store burned down. They didn't have any insurance. and just one story, Edward was kind of known as having sort of a quick wit. And one of the stories that I read from an article that Fred Ferris had written, and Fred Ferris was a newspaper man who was here for quite a number of years. There's a story, the way the story goes anyway, there were two pretty rough guys that were walking a mongrel dog down in front of the store around when Edward was operating it. This would have had to have been in the 20s. Edward was on the sidewalk sweeping the sidewalk. And so he decides to make conversation with these guys, and he asked, well, what kind of dog is that? And they said, well, one of the guys said, it's half Jew and half son of a bitch. And so Edward said, well, I guess it's related to both of us then. I don't know how true that story is, but I kind of hope it is. It does have some sort of truth to it. These are just some more pictures of I think that's my father when he was a baby. That's my grandfather Edward. That would be my father. That would be my uncle Frank when he was really young. I'm not sure who the other boy is. That might have been the only car in town. From what I heard, Kirby Seward for a while had one of the only cars in Punta Gorda, and I kind of have a feeling that was his car. And I think that's my dad in the.
That wasn't the one that got wrecked, was it?
I don't remember that. Probably. I mean, there was that wreck by the train station. I don't think that was.
Yeah, probably something.
Anyway, just another picture, and that was probably down Marion Avenue. I mean, it was just obviously not very well developed or built up. This is a picture of my grandfather in his later years and my uncle. That picture was probably taken around 1940. It would have been before my uncle went into service and shortly before my grandfather passed away. That's my father. And my dad was, like I say, he was born in 1912. And he was born in the Sandlin House. And probably a lot of you know where the Sandlin House is. The Sandlin House is on Retta Esplanade, I think Retta Esplanade and Harvey Street. Maybe it's a yellow house. Anyway, it's still standing. He was born there in 1912, and it still is standing. Again, when my dad was born, it was pretty primitive at the time. But Dad told me a lot. There was a lot of things for young kids to do, or kids to enjoy sort of having fun with. There was one tennis court in town, and I think tennis was actually kind of a big sport back in the late 19 teens and early 1920s. The hotel had a tennis tournament, had some tennis courts, and it was pretty elite. They just couldn't go on the hotel property. It was kind of like, I don't know what you call it. But anyway, it was a very elite hotel. They had a fence to kind of keep the commoners out of the hotel property. But Bill Tilden, who was a big tennis player at the time, he would come and vacation there and had tennis matches there. And I think he was kind of maybe a role model. So a lot of kids back then played tennis. My dad wasn't really an athlete, but he could play a little bit of tennis. My uncle was a real good athlete. To make money, what they would do is they would go up and down the river, the shore, with a bucket and a crab net, and they dip crabs, and they would sell them a bucket for 25 cents. Which would be nice if you could still get a bucket of crabs for 25 cents. My father worked for the Herald when he was still going to high school. It wasn't owned by the Seward family. He'd sold it to the Jordans. And he graduated from Charlotte High School in 1929. And he was bright. He was a valedictorian when he graduated. And as I said, just quickly going through some of what he did, he went to the University of Florida. He somehow managed to get through with a teaching degree. And when he graduated, he came back to Punta Gorda, but he couldn't get a job teaching. So he ended up being a reporter. And he would cover, there were quite a number of stories that he would cover. I remember he would report, there was a ladies' professional golf event that was held at the Punta Gorda Country Club off of Highway 17. And Patty Burr, when she was real young, would play in that. And he wrote articles, and he would sell the articles, or I don't know how they did it back then, but the articles would go to like the AP and get printed in a lot of different places. I'm sure he got a few cents for whatever for those articles. He went to Crescent City for a while. For a year actually. He got back to Punta Gorda finally in 1934. He had a job teaching, and at the same time he was editing the newspaper. So it was busy, just to make a living. You had to do a lot of different things. And in 1936, again, he was only 24 years old, and he'd already lived a pretty active life. He decided, because the school superintendent was an elected position, but it paid more than being a teacher. So he figured, well, I'm just going to run for school superintendent and enhance my income. And the problem is, he ran against Sally Jones, who was a very popular teacher. In fact, there's a picture of her back there on that poster board. And Sally Jones actually was my dad's 6th grade teacher. So that didn't stop him from running against her. And she won. She beat him, and she was very well. In fact, there's a school named for Sally Jones. One of the elementary schools is named for her. I think he kind of got the bug for politics. And in 1938, when he was only 26 years old, he ran for the legislature for Charlotte County, and he won. He was opposed by Vasco Peoples, Vernon Peoples' father, and Frank Smoke Sr. And apparently it was a pretty hotly contested race. I think the state legislature, since there was only one representative from Charlotte County, it got to be kind of a sort of a power struggle. And Dad said the only way that he won, because Frank Smoke got almost enough votes to win without going into a runoff. But Dad beat Vasco just by a few votes, and Vasco turned around and supported Dad, and he was able to win. And for the rest of their lives, my father and Vasco were the closest friends. The terms back then were 2 years, and the legislature only met 60 days every other year. So it's not like it is today. In fact, I remember hearing stories about when they wanted to change it to be every year, and that there was a big opposition to that because everyone thought that it was more than enough for them to meet every other year, much less meeting every year. The districts back then, it was county by county district. So Charlotte County only had about 5,000 people. Dade County probably had around 700,000 people. Dade County had 3 representatives, Charlotte County had 1. So the smaller county representatives, who were only representing a few people, had a lot of power in the legislature. Now it's based on population. So Dade County would have, if they would, and they don't do it by county anymore, they do it by legislative districts. So the smaller county representatives really had quite a bit of power in the legislature. Dad was a very good speaker, he was a very good orator, and he did real well in the legislature. And he was fully involved in the small county town, which was they called them the pork chop gang. I don't know where that came from. But when I was reading, Vernon Peebles did an interview of my dad, kind of an oral history interview for Florida Gulf Coast University, and he asked him what his how he would describe himself, what his political philosophy was. Of course, back then, everybody was Democrat back then. It was, the dynamics of the Democratic Party were a little bit different. There were probably 2 parties in one, but it was just one Democratic Party. So he answered Vernon. He said he felt he was pretty democratic. He wanted to make government serve the people through education, healthcare, and environment. And he said, and this is interesting what he said. I just wanted to repeat this. He said in that interview, "I have never been one who favors just throwing away money for the fun of it, but I have never been against levying taxes when it is necessary. I do not think there is anything that we spend money for that buys anything greater than the freedom we have, the education we have, and the associations we enjoy, and that's paid for with tax money." That was probably back then. That was probably a kind of a prevailing thought among a lot of the legislators. Although my dad's tenure in the legislature was cut shorter than he wanted it to, because he ended up voting for a tax, and when he did that, it kind of reminds me of Bush, the senior Bush. He campaigned that he would never, ever levy a sales tax or vote to levy a sales tax. And I'm going to go over that just in a minute, but he did. And of course, he got slammed and he got beat, which actually turned out to be a pretty good thing. But when the legislature back at the time would enact, and the really importance of the local representatives in the legislature was that a lot of them, now we have a county commission and a city council that will adopt ordinances. Well, back then, for local issues and local concerns, it was the state legislature that would enact local laws to deal with matters of some importance. And when my dad was first in the legislature, or around I guess probably maybe toward the middle and end, there was no law requiring cattle to be fenced. There obviously there is now. It was an open range. Well, the problem was in the late 1930s and going into the 1940s, in the early 1940s, Florida's population was increasing. Charlotte County's population was increasing. There was a lot more people had cars, and there were a lot of roads here, even here in Charlotte County. And the cattle would just come on the roads. They didn't know better, and they get hit. And there were really quite a few accidents, some pretty horrific accidents that were caused as a result of that. So there was an effort locally to require fences and to impose some liability on the owners of the cattle that would get out. And it was very controversial because back then, the cattle industry was a huge part of the business of Charlotte County and Punta Gorda. And so in the early 1940s, though, because of the situation, my dad proposed a local law. It was called the fencing law, and he was the local legislator in Charlotte County. So when he proposed it, and he was pretty senior at the time, it was going to get passed, pretty much. But a lot of the people in Punta Gorda were really either on one side of the fence or the other side of the fence about this law. And it got to be real controversial. And so he would get petitioned. There was a big petitions and letters. I can just imagine back on the streets of Punta Gorda, which there weren't many people really, but the cattle people and the people who worked in the cattle industry, and then the other, a lot of the other citizens who were kind of not involved in it, but who were being sort of victimized by the situation. They sent petitions in, and there was a big petition for, a big petition against, and apparently a lot of the same people signed both petitions because apparently they did a petition. Okay, I'll sign it.
From Chicago.
So the clerk of the court of Charlotte County in 1945, who was Ed Scott, that's Joanne's great uncle. Uncle.
Yeah.
He was a clerk of the court, and he wrote Dad kind of sort of a scathing letter. You know, this is a pretty big deal. You're gonna get skewered if you let this thing pass. It's probably not gonna be that good for you. So instead of emailing and so forth, they all wrote letters. And this is a letter that my dad wrote in response. And these were, and by the way, they might have had their differences, but they were all really close. In fact, my dad helped Scotty toward the end of his clerkship when he had run into some issues. But so Dad responded to the letter. He goes, and this is in April 26, 1945, when this was all coming to a head. He goes, dear Scotty, I'm now in possession of 2 long petitions, one for and one against the proposed livestock fencing law. There are several duplications of names on the 2 petitions. I know this question is really hot on the streets of Punta Gorda at this time, and I have given some consideration to putting a referendum on this bill, which would send it back to the voters. He goes, the matter resolves itself, however, to this situation. There is no question about how the people will vote on this matter if I am any judge of the situation. If I provide for an immediate referendum, it will cost the county an unreasonable amount of money, and if I postpone this referendum until the general election next year, some 2 years will have elapsed before it will be possible to place the law in effect. Confidentially, I've just about decided to pass the law without the referendum feature on it, and to defer the effective date of it for 6 months to let people put fences, to give people a chance to get fences up. Naturally, the passage of this law will bring down upon me a great deal of unholy wrath on one hand, but I am convinced that it is right, and on a long-term basis is in the interest of the greatest majority of people in Charlotte County. There is no other basis on which I can determine my action on any bill. Then he goes, after all, this is a rather small political job. The very least I can do is to pass constructive legislation. If I'm defeated for doing that, I shall not have lost very much, and my conscience will be entirely clear. And when he said it wasn't that much, well, it paid $6. The legislators back then got $6 a day, $360 for the whole term they were in the legislature. But on the other hand, it only cost them about $100 or $200 in campaign costs to run for the legislature at the most, which I'm sure a lot of the guys running this year would love it if that was the case. Another letter, and I guess I wanted to go over this because this interested me when I was going through this, because you know, the issues that people were facing back in the historic times were a lot different than we're facing now. In some sense, they were easier. They were just more straightforward, like, yeah, get the cattle fenced in, you know, pretty basic questions. He also got a letter from Mr. Babcock, who had the biggest cattle ranch around. And the big cattle people weren't necessarily, from what I understood, they weren't really all that opposed to it because they had all kinds of money and they could fence things pretty well. But the small cattle ranchers would have really more of a rough time with it. But anyway, apparently Fred Babcock wrote him a letter, and so Dad responded. Again, 1945, he goes, "Thank you for your letter with regard to the proposed fencing law. I believe I advised both you and Friday," who was another family that had a large cattle interest. I believe I advised both you and Friday, as well as others, long before I came up here, that I intended to pass this bill. It has never been my policy to alter my position on a matter because of pressure alone and without substantial reason. The bill has been advertised, blah, blah, blah. You, of course, know also that I felt and still feel that I was left far out on a limb by all of the folks who were most directly interested in having this law passed. So apparently there's a backstory about this also. And Dad goes on and he says, "My inclination would have been to abandon the whole thing had it not been for the fact that I know that a very great majority of people in the county rightfully demand that a fencing law be enacted." Earl Farr was an attorney in town at the time. In fact, he was an honoree at the History Center, one of the honorees last month. Earl Farr was up here yesterday and told me that a petition is being circulated in the county requesting that I pass this law. I'm naturally hopeful that it will reflect what I believe to be the sentiment there. So anyway, that was, I guess that's just kind of an example of some of the things that they dealt with. Another big issue in the 1930s and 40s, and it kind of still is commercial fishing. The fishing and cattle were really the big industries here, or the large businesses here, and I guess phosphate mining too, in the early 20th century. And back in the 1940s, there was an effort to enact local laws to restrict commercial fishing. In other words, to prevent the fishermen from putting nets like at the mouth of Alligator Creek and just letting the fish run into them coming out of the creek. So Fort Myers, the Lee County representative, did get some local laws passed that severely restricted commercial fishing. Problem was my dad had a lot of support in the commercial fishing industry, so it is political. He said, okay, well, we'll go ahead and this I can't I really can't oppose this bill, but we'll make a few amendments to it that I think you'll probably like. And he was talking to his commercial fishing constituents, and one of the amendments was where the netting would be prohibited, and the netting ended up in these early bills being prohibited only like so far up Alligator Creek you could hardly get a boat to where the netting was prohibited in some of the other creeks. But that was also controversial. Another, and this was a real big topic, was education. And I'm not going to go into I was going to go into more detail, but I don't want to drag on too much. But Florida, when my dad was in the legislature, was one of the lowest, had one of the lowest ratings of any state for public education. I mean, education was horrible. And and my dad ended up being chairman of the education committee before he left the House. And it was so bad that the governor appointed a special citizens committee to study what could be done to improve education in Florida. And my dad was one of the members of the committee, and the committee spent a couple of years studying the whole process, and they came up with a kind of a template to improve public education. And what the template involved was, among other things, to require that teachers actually themselves had an education. And that they approved, and this is probably the most important thing about what they did, and this was kind of a template for not only Florida, but it turned out to be a template for a lot of other states. They adopted or approved what was called the minimum foundation. And the whole concept there was to provide the same dollars for students in small counties versus large counties. And the only way to do that was to raise some revenue, because back then and even today, a lot of the revenue that goes into funding the school system comes from our property taxes. In fact, if you look at your property tax bill, you'll see a large part of it goes to public education. Well, some counties have bigger tax rolls than other counties, and that was especially true in the 1930s and 40s. So the small counties had hardly any money that could be devoted to education. So the minimum foundation required some sort of equalization, and it required state revenues to be able to equalize or provide that minimum foundation funding. And they met, they were having all kinds of trouble figuring out how to raise the revenue. They wanted a severance tax on the phosphates. Well, that wasn't gonna go anyplace back then. And so a group of the leadership met in 1949, and this is a true story. They met, and my dad was involved in it. They met in an orange grove in Kissimmee. There was no, probably at night, but anyway, there was no sunshine law at the time. And it was the governor, the chairman of some of the key committees, and some of the leadership of the House and the Senate. And they just were agonizing over what they could do, but they all were good, you know, they had good intentions. They wanted to see that education was properly funded. And of course, and my dad had a real interest in that too. He was a teacher, he was still a teacher, he had not gone to law school yet. So they decided the only way they could fund it, the only practical solution would be to enact a sales tax. And that's what they did. And it was a 3% tax, but there were a whole lot of exemptions, as there still are. And it was very difficult because Dad wasn't alone. You know, there were a lot of these folks. They were very fiscally conservative. They were all against any new taxes, but they did it. And as I said, Dad was defeated in his next bid for the legislature in 1950 as a result of that. That actually turned out to be good for him because if it had not been for that, he probably would never have gone to law school. And he'd always wanted to be an attorney. My uncle was already an attorney. And so he went to law school. He got through pretty quick. It was kind of rough for him still because they still didn't have hardly any money. He taught legal classes in the business school while he was going to law school himself. So he was trying to teach a full teaching load while he was going to law school. And I don't know if any of you all have been to law school or not, but just studying law is a full-time job in itself. I don't know how anybody can do anything else. Anyway, he graduated in around 1953. He and my mom got married after he got out of law school, and he began practicing law here with my uncle. And I did want to say one thing. Teresa sort of encouraged me to do this. My mother, Zena Cox, she was from South Georgia, from Statesboro, Georgia. And she came to Punta Gorda as a teacher. She was a teacher. She was the first one in her family of 10 to have an education. And when she was real young in the 1940s, probably middle, late 1940s, she came to Punta Gorda for a teaching job. And it was kind of ironic because my father was still teaching at the time, and he was the editor of the paper, and the school board had him do a brochure because they wanted to try to attract teachers from other places. And somehow she saw that brochure, and I guess they, well, how do you say it? They puffed everything up enough to where she thought it would be a good thing to come. But for someone from a farm, a little small farm in South Georgia to come all the way to at Punta Gorda. I mean, I still can't even imagine that. But anyway, they ended up getting married after my dad was in law school, and back then there was a disease going around, and it got pretty it was nationally known about the disease. It was called Iceland disease. I know you might remember that.
Mother had it.
Yeah, and what's that?
My mother had it.
Oh, she did.
Yeah.
What year is this?
This was this was 1954,
Before you were
55,
born.
yeah. And it was apparently a pretty serious illness, pretty serious disease, and a lot of women would have miscarriages and so forth. So this was a thing in the newspaper. It said Mrs. Leo Wotitzky, who was victim of the strange illness that plagued Punta Gorda last year, shows off her healthy 7-month-old son. Her greatest fear of the illness, termed Iceland disease, was of losing her child by miscarriage. Some mothers were reported to have had miscarriages because of the illness. Anyway, it was big. It was kind of a big story. But I thought that was.
You wouldn't be here.
Yeah, I wouldn't be here, so I'm glad she didn't have it that bad. When my dad got out, started practicing law, he was really his years as a teacher and as a legislator, he kind of honed his verbal skills, and he was real good speaker, real good advocate. He did just a ton of trial work, a lot of appellate work, and he and my uncle somehow ended up representing the Vanderbilt family, and the Vanderbilts own almost all. I wish I had this old tax map, but they own almost all the property in Charlotte County west of the Mayaca River, except for along the coast that other families had owned. Just a huge swath of land, and they ultimately decided to sell a lot of it to the Kavanaugh Corporation, which developed Rotunda, which was supposed to be a magnificent, really circular development, a real big thing. And I do have some very vague memories of my dad spending a lot of time in New York, and he got to know the Vanderbilts pretty well when he was doing that. I always thought that was kind of neat anyway. My dad and my uncle were also involved in a lot of civic activities. One of the important things that they helped with was the establishment of a local hospital. We didn't have a hospital in Punta Gorda, or Charlotte County for that matter, until around 1947 or 48. And my dad was very instrumental in that. And as a matter of fact, he was the chairman of the hospital board and for quite some time. And there was little litigation off and on about that he was involved in as well. It was, in fact, I was probably I was born in 1956. That's where I was born. I might have been one of the first. Well, I wasn't one of the first people there, but the first patient there at the hospital was Gussie Baker. She had an appendix rupture, and she had her appendix repaired by probably Dr. Clement.
It was Dr. Clement.
It was one of the first doctors in the hospital, and that's the same doctor who delivered me. My dad and my uncle were also they're also really involved. This is post coming back and being an attorney in the development of Edison College. Here they worked on getting the land and helped getting the land for Edison to build a campus here in Punta Gorda, off of Carmelita, and Florida Gulf Coast University. In business, they were involved in banking. They formed a couple of banks over the years, and the one thing that I always thought was kind of interesting, there was a small group of guys that somehow thought they wanted to be television magnates, and it was Ed Ponger and Ron Kays. They had the funeral homes here in Charlotte County, and there was somebody else, and they approached Dad. And they said, listen, we've got a chance to get a license for a television station in Cape Coral. It's a brand new television station. and we got the guy who's gonna help us out. We just need to have some money. Will you contribute, and you can be on the committee, with with your resume, it probably would help us too, get it. So they ended up getting the license, and they ended up putting together and opening, or however you say it, a television station. It was in Cape Coral, and I forgot the name of the station. It was Channel 4. I remember that. And in fact, Lindsey Harrington, who was in the I don't know if he was in the legislature at the time, but he was a realtor. One of the problems they had to have a big tower, and they kind of got the land for the tower, but they forgot that, or just didn't occur to them, that they had to have guy wires, and these towers were huge, and they had to have guy wires going around. The adjoining property owners didn't like the fact that there was a tower there in the first place, and they certainly weren't going to let them put guy wires over on their property. So Lindsey kind of knew a lot of the people, and he ended up being able to. He was a broker at the time, Lindsey Harrington. He was one of our state representatives too. He ended up somehow getting the easements that they needed to put the guy wires up to get the tower formed. But what was ironic about that, I think I mentioned before, my dad was a Democrat. He never changed, and he was always very strongly Democratic, no matter what. And when the station was ultimately sold, it was sold to a group that had a franchise, a Fox News franchise. so the station he started was a Fox. It's what you see as Fox News. The kind of want to end it here. Again, I'm probably dwelling on stuff that my dad did a little bit more. There's a lot of history otherwise, but I thought that there were a couple things that were interesting. After my dad kind of was getting up in years, he never really retired from practicing law, but what he really got involved in was being an advocate, and he wrote letter after letter after letter to the editor of the newspaper. And in fact, Derek Dunrankin, who was the editor of the newspaper, finally said, "Listen, I'll just give you a weekly column. Just do one a week." So he did one a week, and there's a couple that I just thought were real interesting. The first one is not really a letter to the editor. This is a letter to the Florida Lawyers Action Group, which was kind of a PAC for the Florida bar. And this is a letter that was written in 1982. That was actually still fairly active at that time. And this political action committee had supported Vernon People. This is, I think, when Vernon Peoples first ran for state legislature. And they supported someone who was running against him. I can't remember. It might have been Dr. Shedd, but I can't remember who it was. But so they contributed to it. Well, that just infuriated my dad. He was an attorney, and he was pretty involved in the bar at the time. So he wrote to them. He goes, "Gentlemen," this is after Vernon got won. He goes, "You wasted a couple of $500 contributions on the losing candidate for representative from the 72nd district, comprising parts of Lee, Charlotte, and DeSoto counties. As you undoubtedly know by this time, Vernon Peoples was a successful candidate, and I am quite sure you have offended him. Your credibility with him is about zero. The exercise of a minimum amount of common sense, it seems to me, might have avoided this waste of money and influence. I'm the senior member of the largest law firm in this county," and it was back then in the 80s. "And no one consulted me about the political climate here. If your activities generally have been and this is kind of, he was pretty straight. He didn't mince words. Thank you. Dan. He goes, "If your activities generally have been characterized by the degree of stupidity reflected here, I have no doubt the Florida bar is in trouble. Yeah, in the future, our inclination to contribute to your activity will be slight indeed." And he copied Jim Reineman, who was the president of the Florida bar at the time, and William Henry, who was pretty well known, and he was the incoming president of the Florida bar. Just a couple more. I just thought these were really interesting. He was always very up to date, and he kept himself current on local things that were happening locally. In 1996, there was an effort, or it was time for the Punta Gorda Charter to be inspected or studied. And he got a little bit upset about how the city was doing it. And so he wrote in his column, he said, Punta Gorda's city council seems to be unable to avoid attempting to do things that are illegal. A recent example, of course, is the ill-fated readiness to serve effort that resulted in a court order to pay back the money after spending about $300,000 of taxpayer money in a futile defense of that illegal imposition. That the readiness to serve fee, it was a tax that the city of Punta Gorda decided to charge on vacant lots before they were hooked up to any utilities. They were charged a lot. I think somehow they might do that now, but in any event. Then he goes on to say, now the council has done it again. It has by ordinance attempted to unilaterally amend the city charter by adopting recommendations of a charter review committee. That it could not do. In an opinion issued in 1979 by the Florida Attorney General, the Florida Attorney General said it can't be done as the city has attempted. The charter can only be amended by a vote of the registered voters of the city. Goes on and on again. The council adopted all the changes proposed by the Charter Review Committee, including authority for council members to raise their pay immediately. I stress that. Thus, it accepted the unauthorized recommendation of the committee, which asserted that the committee believes that none of the amendments proposed herein is controversial or of such significance that a referendum is necessary or justified. The committee tells the council to ignore the law, and the council agrees. What will be the effect of this? Unless changes are submitted to the voters, the council will be operating under void charter provisions. The possible ramifications are unlimited in number and severity. Will they never learn? It wasn't really just city council. I mean, he studied and kept up to speed on what the county commission was doing at the time. And in 1996, the county commission was upset for some reason with the Southwest Florida Water Management District. They wanted I guess the Water Management District was doing something that they felt would harm Peace River, would harm the quality of the water in Peace River. So anyway, he writes this letter. He goes, and this is in January of 1996. He goes, like Don Quixote riding out to fight windmills with a wooden sword, the Charlotte County Commission, by a 4-to-1 vote, appropriated $450,000 of our tax money to do battle against the Southwest Florida Water Management District in an effort to protect the Peace River. This is what's funny. At the same meeting, the board voted to kill the county's sewer program, which is designed to stop the pollution in Peace River. In one vote, the board says it wants to protect the Peace River. In another, it votes to continue allowing the river to be polluted by septic tank effluent. Then too, as if that wasn't enough, while the county is preparing to waste $450,000 of our taxes on a fight with the Southwest Florida Water Management District, some of our taxes are being used to support the Southwest Florida Water Management District. We're fighting ourselves, and that's true. If you notice on your tax bill, your property tax bill, a portion of our property taxes goes to the Southwest Florida Water Management District, and it did back then as well. Then he goes on to say, the same county commission took Charlotte County out of the 4-county consortium controlling use of Peace River water, ridiculously waiving the county's right to receive a part of the additional water to be taken from the river. That water will go to Sarasota County. And I haven't really kept up with that issue, but I think there's still some issues about that. He goes, where will Charlotte County get the additional water it will surely need? These are not minor issues. The economic future of this county is at stake, and our county commission has come down on the wrong side of both. So anyway, he really was, every now and then too, he even wrote more controversial letters. And about then, I started practicing law in 1981 or 82. And he would, every now and then, when he wrote a letter to the editor, because he knew I was kind of just getting started, and he kind of felt, well, maybe if I write this letter, it might not be good for my son's business. He would ask me if, to read it and if I thought it was okay. And you know, I basically took the position that, you know, hey, he lived a whole lifetime. He definitely kept more up to date on things. He was more astute about these things by far than I ever was and I ever will be. And I said, I always told him, I said, no, send it in. But, you know, that's okay. Just go ahead and send it in. And I think he still probably did pull back a few without me knowing about it. But anyway, yeah, there's a lot. You know, we all have family histories and everything, and I know sometimes it's kind of a little boring to hear about some other people's family histories, but the thing that I guess I thought was a little interesting about maybe the family, that's a picture of my mom. She actually lived to be 100, almost 101. She just died last year. So anyway, what I thought was kind of interesting, might be interesting, at least in the context of the Punta Gorda History Center, is the fact that you know, my dad's family, you know, direct and indirect, starting with that guy, were you know, came here and they really were living in Punta Gorda throughout pretty much its whole history. And there's probably a lot of other little, not little, but there's probably a lot of other things that they did or were involved in that we could look at. Teresa told me some stuff I didn't really know about my own family, and that's what's important about organizations like the Punta Gorda History Center, because no matter how we, you know, I just know for myself, I've always been interested in history, but with family history, I've never, you know, it's just kind of glossed over. I hear it, but I think, okay, well, that's, you know, not that big a deal, really. And you know, for us, for your family, it should be. But for anyway, what the Punta Gorda History Center does is archive and catalog individual histories of local people and local families in Punta Gorda and Charlotte County. And it started off with Vernon's collection, and a lot of what I know about my family actually did come from Vernon and from some of the things that he put together here. So it's been really an honor for me to be involved in the Punta Gorda History Center. I can't thank Gene and Teresa and Martha and the volunteers enough for what they've done. I think that a lot of our history would be lost if it wasn't for these types of organizations, because it is easy to lose history. And I know just trying to follow and just create this timeline, and I've been busy at work, so I haven't had as much time to do this as I would like to. But it took a major effort just to do this timeline and try to get it as accurate as I could. So anyway, that's it. That's all I have.